Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 249. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Geoff Loftus about his new book, The Devil's Vacation. It is the 10th book in his Jack Tyrrell thriller series. The main character, Jack Tyrrell, is a former Special Forces veteran and Deputy U.S. Marshal who was introduced to his guardian angel by the spirit of his dead wife. Over the course of the series, Jack solves crimes and rights wrongs with the help of his guardian angel. In The Devil's Vacation, which is set on a small island off the coast of Rhode Island, Jack finds his summer vacation interrupted by a brutal double murder. The deaths have familiar hallmarks, and Jack and his guardian angel are forced into a confrontation with evil in the form of a serial killer and his guardian devil. In this episode, I'll chat with Geoff about his writing journey, how he admits that he began this series for purely commercial desires, and how the storyline and his main characters, Jack Tyrrell and the Guardian Angel, were inspired by Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, as well as a few other things, coming up. Geoff Loftus, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
You're welcome.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your latest book, The Devil's Vacation. Now, I should say this is the 10th book in your thriller series, the Jack Tyrrell series. I knew I was going to mess it up. The Jack Tyrrell series. So what I'd like to do before we dive into the book is talk a bit about the series in general. So if you can give us sort of an overview, an introduction to the series, and in particular, Let's talk about what inspired you to start writing it.
Okay. What inspired me to write it, I have to confess, was strictly crass commercial desires. I was not selling a lot of books. I'd written several standalone thrillers, and they weren't really selling. I sold 100, 200 copies a year. It was nothing. And everything I read in publishing trends said that if you want to sell books, you have to write a series. Doesn't matter if it's a Western or romance or sci-fi or thrillers or mysteries, or series are where the action is. So I decided on a strictly commercial rationale that I was going to write a series. So I cast about in the vast, empty reaches of my mind for some kind of character, some kind of setup that I wouldn't go crazy writing, something that I would not bore me to tears, frankly, after a third or fourth book. And I spent months doing this. I really could not think of anything. And I went through a lot of formulaic stuff that just left me cold. And in a moment of frustration, actually, I thought, I just wish I could write one book that's half as good as A Christmas Carol, which is my favorite book. I thought if I could write one book half as good as A Christmas Carol, I'd retire from writing a happy man. Now, I don't know why that thought came to me, but it did. And the thing that happened was I realized I could use the Marley's Ghost talking to Ebenezer Scrooge to launch my thriller series. And Marley's Ghost, in this case, is Jack Tyrrell's late wife. Tyrell is, of course, the Scrooge character. He's a drunken loser when we first meet him in the first book, Murderous Spirit. And his wife arranges for him to meet an angel. And his angel's name is Harry. And Harry takes the place of the three spirits of Christmas past, present, and yet to come. And this all happened. This all fell into place in my mind in about 30 seconds. And I started thinking about what the first book would be like. And then the second book came to me. And then the third book came to me. And from the time I first thought I could use the Marley's Ghost device to the time I had three books in their entirety in my mind was about 4 or 5 minutes. It was, I've never had an experience like that in my writing, never. And so it was just fabulous experience. And I set off to write. And Tyrell, as I said, was a drunken loser when we first meet him. He's a former Deputy U.S. Marshal, a former Green Beret. His wife was killed when he was targeted in an assassination. She died, he lived, and he's just a drunken bum. And she sets him on the road to righting wrongs for people. And Harry, his angel, helps him do that. And one of the ideas I had was that this wouldn't just be a thriller. Hopefully it is thrilling, and hopefully the action is hot and quick and contemporary, but there would be a spiritual aspect to these books. And so Tyrell struggles with different spiritual questions as he's moving through the books. And yeah, that's how I got inspired, and that's how Tyrell came to be.
Well, let's talk about the latest book, because and first, I guess we should address there are 10 books in the series.
Yes.
And I think before we started recording, you mentioned that each story within the book, each, mystery or whatever in the book is standalone.
Yes,
so people, people can pick up a book in the series, read it, and the plot of that book is self-contained. But there is a story arc for this character that follows him from book 1 through book 10. So
the spiritual arc.
Right. So if you want the most out of the series, you would start with book 1 and follow the characters all the way through. But it's not impossible to just pick up book 4 and start there.
No, not at all.
If that's the one you find. So, okay. Well, let's talk about book 10, which is the latest, The Devil's Vacation. Can you set this one up for us? Where are the characters and what are they faced with?
Book 10 is very unusual, even within an unusual series, in that it takes place entirely on Block Island, which is a small island off the coast of Rhode Island. It's about 25 miles northeast of Montauk, for those of your listeners who are familiar with the New York region. And it's a charming little New England town, island. And it's about a serial killer, a psychopathic serial killer, who is aided by his guardian devil. Tyrell is aided by his guardian angel, and the psychopathic killer on Block Island is aided by a psychopathic devil. It's the first time I've written a book that's completely contained in one location, other than Manhattan. Most of my books, the majority of my books' stories take place in Manhattan, and there are trips to the surrounding geography of New York, and there have been trips to London and Rome and Paris, for those of you who like a little travel thrown in. But this is the only book that does not take place at all in Manhattan and only takes place in one location. But the biggest thing is it's a direct confrontation with evil. When you're dealing with a demon, you're dealing with evil in its purest, most horrific form. And that's, frankly, it's an idea I had 4 or 5 books ago, and I just wasn't ready to tackle it. I couldn't do it. and I wanted to, and I was thinking about it, but I just, I didn't have the nerve, so I didn't. It's also different in that many of the Tyrrell books have Jack confronting a villain or two who have a bunch of henchmen. Because one of the things Jack does is he manages to outfight and outshoot multiple guys. But in this book, it's just the psychopathic killer and the guardian devil. So it's a much tighter focus. There's a lot of big action scenes using the geography of the island, but the confrontation on a person to person level, much tighter and more focused than the other books.
So, what was the challenge in that? I mean, when you have a bigger stage and a larger cast, I imagine it's easy to create a lot of craziness and mayhem and mystery and suspense and tension. But when you're dealing with really two main characters plus two sort of unseen characters in a way, right? I mean, they're there, but they're not physically standing face to face in a way. That's it. And on an island, it's sort of the idea of the locked room scenario. How do you keep up the tension when that's all you've got? You've limited yourself to a small stage and a small number of actors.
Well, because this is a serial killer, one of the things that happens, this is also, I should say, that this book is actually a bit of a sequel to one of my standalone thrillers, which was called The Dark Saint. And when they discover the first bodies in The Devil's Vacation, they wonder if the killer who was around in The Dark Saint has returned. Now, this is impossible because the killer in The Dark Saint was killed himself. But since you're dealing with a guardian devil, who knows what's possible? But because this is a serial killer and because whoever it is some sort of copycat for the Dark Saint, and a multi-jurisdictional task force is formed almost immediately. So not only do you have the Block Island Police, but you have the Rhode Island State Police and you have the FBI. So the law enforcement side is actually very big. There's a lot of people, a lot of vehicles. They have a helicopter. I mean, it's quite big. Usually in the Tyrrell books, the villains have all the hardware and the resources. And part of the point is that Jack Tyrrell does not need all these resources because he's got God on his side. I'm not sure I mentioned that before, that one of the things that his late wife sets up in the first book is that he's working for God, who's called the chairman in the books. But there's no mistake about it. He's working for God to right wrongs. And so one of the themes is he doesn't need the kind of resources you might think he needs because he's got God on his side.
So how do you give personality to the angels? I mean, I can understand a bit about crafting a character. So Jack Tyrrell, you craft him and people can visualize them, him and villains and things in their minds. How do you give form to a concept like a guardian angel or guardian devil? And I imagine in many ways that's even more fun to write.
Oh, it can be. Yes, it can be. I owe a great debt to a movie called The Adjustment Bureau, which was written and directed by George Nolfi. And he adapted that from a story called The Adjustment Team, written by the great sci-fi writer Philip K. Dick. And although it's never quite explicit that the main character from the Adjustment Bureau, which is some sort of semi-divine group of people who show up and literally adjust human beings' lives. But the main character is played by the wonderful actor Anthony Mackie. And so I based Harry on Anthony Mackie. So he's this dapper black man. He's approximately 40-ish, but he could be older. He could be younger. One of the things that becomes clear is that time doesn't matter for Harry the way it does for human beings, and that he looks like a black man because that's a persona that Tyrrell can relate to. So he appears in a form that Tyrrell likes and finds relatable. By the same token, when I was doing the demon for The Devil's Vacation, I wanted something that might throw people a little bit. So originally I was thinking it would be a male. And then I thought, no, that's so cliche, a male devil. Let's make it a woman. So I imagined this very elegant, slender British woman, somebody like Vanessa Redgrave. She's very calm, and she doesn't worry about things. And the psychopathic killer is much more of a sort of blue collar murderer. So you have that odd discrepancy between her kind of elegance. She doesn't get mad. There's no pea soup vomiting in this movie, in this book. There's no, it's not that kind of exorcist possession thing. Although I actually quote from The Exorcist several times in the book, but.
So it sounds like in writing this series, you have a number of different influences. You've mentioned movies and other books and things. Do you draw your inspiration from those genres, those mediums? And is that how you picture the stories? Do you picture them, say, as movies or something that plays out in your head?
Yes, I definitely see. I visualize almost everything I write very definitely, and it doesn't matter whether it's an action scene or a romantic interlude or when I'm introducing a character. Now, some characters I use as a model. For instance, I mentioned Anthony Mackie as my model for Harry. Harry does not behave exactly the way Anthony Mackie's character behaves in The Adjustment Bureau, but he was a good visual model for me. I found it very appealing. And so that's how I did that. In some of the books, a lot of the characters are very, 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 very loosely, did I emphasize very loosely, based on people I know. I don't want my friends to go looking for themselves in the books.
I was the villain in book 5.
But I find it much easier to write Tyrrell's personal side if some of the people he's involved with are based on people I've been involved with. So they make sense to me, and I don't have to spend a lot of time agonizing over what she is going to do or what he is going to do, because I know these people. And so I just put them in. Now, I change details about them, and you always have to be careful. I always have to be careful when I do something like that, because if I'm adding detail or changing details in a real person, is that still consistent with the character that I was trying to get? You can become so busy disguising the character that you get away from the very things you wanted from the real person. Right. So you have to balance that kind of stuff out.
Yeah. Well, in your opinion, what makes for a good villain? Because you've had to come up with, obviously, the bad guys in a lot of different books now. So, and I'm sure the challenge is to vary them and to make them feel unique and different. But what do you like to see in a villain? What do you find satisfying in either a villain that you watch or you read or you write?
Hitchcock once said that a villain is a charming man who threatens a beautiful woman. And I like that, but I have not found it that simple. Although several of my villains have been charming on the surface and have threatened women. It's one of the things I think about with each new book. I think about, all right, what have the villains been already? So unless I have a really good justification, I don't repeat myself. Now, I'm not going to say I've never repeated myself. That's not true. But for the most part, I try to avoid it. There was one villain who appeared in the fourth book, Dangerous Purpose, who I deliberately kept alive so that I could bring him back in the next book, No Traveler Returns. So that was a conscious thing that he was going to make an encore, which was something I didn't decide until the last 30 pages of the book he was introduced in. It just came to me that I can't kill this guy off, much as I wanted to, but I couldn't kill him off. He needed to come back because there was more to do with this guy. But usually I think about, well, what would be different than the other people? And most of my villains are motivated by the basics: lust, greed, narcissism. I did write a book where the villain is a billionaire narcissist. I don't know where I got that idea from. And so, I go for different personalities and different motivations, but basically they're all greedy, lustful, dishonest people.
Well, let's talk about some of the decisions you make when you write the book, because I'm curious about how the book, each of them, comes together. So things like, do you prefer a detailed outline? Do you plot everything out? Or do you want to pants from the very beginning? Do you always know the ending? Who speaks and what tense and that sort of thing? Were these things that you sat down and thought about before you even started writing, or do they sort of develop organically as you're writing?
Wow, very good questions. So I mentioned before that when I had my moment of inspiration and the three first books popped into my mind almost in their entirety, I wrote down enough notes that I would remember each of the books. So I knew where I was going and I knew what the arc was. I wouldn't say it was an outline, but it had a lot of detail and enough notes for me to know where I was going. Do I always know? By the way, I should say that I have gotten away from outlining. The more I write, the less I use outlines. I will think about where I need to go over the next 2-3 chapters and make sure I'm on track. And I do occasionally go back, even in the middle of writing a book, I'll go back and restructure some of the stuff I've done in front because I realize my pacing is off or whatever. And then, of course, in revisions, I read everything again and I'm looking at things like pacing and structure. So far, I don't think I've messed up without having an outline. And it does kind of free me to go wherever it's going. So maybe I've just become an action automaton and I spew this stuff. I don't know. You said about voicing and voice and tense. I decided to write in the past tense because I think most people find that relatively easy to read. I've read some wonderful books in the present tense, but it always kind of jars me a little bit when I read that. It's in the past tense. The other thing is I decided it was going to be in the first person of Tyrrell because it really allows me, the author, to show you what's going on in my hero's head. And because my books are about this guy's journey, spiritually and emotionally, he's recovering from a lot of stuff. He has PTSD from his time in the army. He has his alcoholism. He has grief over his late wife. And so he's got a lot of stuff on his plate, and it really helps. I also wanted a kind of conversational tone because I find that really sucks me in when I'm reading a book like that. And I wanted it to suck my readers into the story without really thinking about it. And it's much easier to maintain a conversational tone if the narrator is speaking to you, the reader. Right. So I went with that. My last reason for going with a first person narrator is that Tyrrell is in many ways like I am. Now, to be clear, it's not autobiographical. Tyrrell is a former Green Beret, and he's a former Deputy U.S. Marshal, and he's 6'2". I'm 5'7", and I'm an English major, so we're not the same. But we're both Irish Catholic kids. We're both Jesuit trained wise asses, and I know this guy. I do understand him, and I relate to his grief and his confusion by thinking about tough times in my life where I had grief and I had confusion, and I just moved them over into him. So I don't have to think about what Tyrrell is like, which is a huge release because it allows me to concentrate on the plotting and the structure and the action. Now, the last thing about voice, I do occasionally cut to, that goes back to your idea of, do I visualize? I literally cut to another scene, and I often go third person in those scenes, because the advantage of third person narration is that you, the author, can show your readers any characters doing anything. So when you want to show the bad guys setting up a bomb to threaten the good guys, you need to cut away to the bad guys. And the only way I can do that in a largely first person narration is literally to cut away to a third person section. The third person sections are always very short. They're just long enough to let the reader know what the bomb is that's being set up and give them a little bit of insight into the bad guys, a little bit of insight that is separate from Tyrrell's perspective on them. So I think that covered all of your questions.
I gave you a lot. You mentioned earlier that you had written a couple of novels and then you landed on the idea for this series. And you've also, I read in your bio, done a lot of business writing in the past. So I'm curious if you can sort of compare and contrast for us what you've done before and the types of writing you've done before and the way you've approached that writing, how that is similar or different from what you're doing now, working on this very long continuing thriller series. And what do you draw from your prior experience?
Well, the biggest thing I draw from is that it's the old thing that they taught us, I think, in high school composition class, where the teacher would sit there and say, the first thing you have to understand about writing a composition is, what do you want to say? You need to know what you want to say. And then you have to choose a form for it. So if you want to express your love for some beautiful young woman, maybe a poem is the way you should be going, or whatever it is. So the idea of what am I trying to say and what is the form? Now, once you've settled on that for a series, you don't have to re-litigate it in your own mind again and again and again. But it does help to remember, what am I trying to say? Why am I using the form I've chosen? And stick to that. Because occasionally I forget. My third person narrations, for instance, are drier and more straightforward than when Tyrrell is narrating the rest of the story, because he's no longer telling the story during the third person blocks. And I slip up and I start inserting things that the narrator, the third person narrator, should not be saying. So I have to clean those out of there. And that's all about form and what am I trying to say? I did have to make decisions about voice and tone and tense. The business book I wrote, Lead Like Ike, was all about Eisenhower's experience as the leader of the D-Day invasion and how that compares to a modern American CEO running a business in very tough times. The book was written in 2009, middle of the financial crisis. And I realized that I could slip in some amusing observations from time to time, but by and large, that's a much more straightforward book. I don't do a lot of writerly ruffles and flourishes. That's just not appropriate. There were business cases. So I'm doing history with Eisenhower and making comparisons. But at the same time, there were modern day business cases that illustrated, I don't know, the battle between Best Buy and Circuit City, a pair of retailers that Circuit City is gone now. And I think Best Buy is on its last legs. So there's a case study that needs to get updated. But that was an interesting challenge, and the form of that was different. And then the other main blogging I did, or business writing I did, was a blog for Forbes. And that was about leadership. It came out of my writing the book about Eisenhower. And when you're writing a blog, you have to think about a lot of things that you wouldn't normally think about, certainly with a book. Blogs need to be short. Now, my editors at Forbes never said to me, you're going on too long. But I was gently, and I do mean gently, encouraged to keep it short, like, 600 to 800 words. And I joked that I can barely clear my throat in 600 words. So it's a challenge to write a blog, and a challenge for me. And when you are writing on leadership in a blog, you have to deliver a message. People like a lesson, a tool. So I not only have to explain whatever situation I'm doing, like I wrote a blog about Mickey Mouse leadership. And so I have to explain why Mickey Mouse is a good leader example. And then what are the lessons you can take away from Mickey Mouse in approximately 600 to 800 words. That gets challenging.
Right.
So that's how, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, what is up next for you? Because you've done a lot of different kinds of writing. More books in this series, other kinds of books that you want to write? Like what other goals do you have?
What other goals do I have? Well, I am in the middle of writing the 11th Tyrrell book called Repentance. So you can see the spiritual side is still going on. And the every so often I sort of do a palate cleanser where I write a romantic comedy screenplay. And I submit them to film festivals and things like that. I was a screenwriter at one time in my life and did get a couple of things produced. And so I still do that every once in a while. And I actually have the rough ideas of another romantic comedy screenplay. And I think I write them more because they're so different.
Right.
The structuring in a screenplay is so different. It's about 80% dialogue, which is a nice way of doing things. And romantic comedies are so different than these hard-edged thrillers I write with a deep spiritual tone. It's just a great change of pace. So right. I would love it if one of them got singled out at some film festival and got me attention, but I don't really care, actually.
Right. It sounds sort of like the writer's equivalent of like a polar plunge or something.
I think that's a little too bracing, a polar plunge, but yes.
But effective.
Oh, yeah. That'll wake you up.
Well, it sounds like you're busy. So if people want to keep up with the latest books that you're releasing and things that you have going on, that sort of thing, where can they go to find you and that information?
My website is the easiest place, which is www.geoffloftus, one word, geoffloftus.com.
And if people want to purchase a copy of The Devil's Vacation, Book 10, or any of the other books in the series, where can they go to buy them?
All of my books are on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. They're available in ebook and paperback at Barnes & Noble, and they're available in ebook, paperback, and audio on Amazon.
Excellent. How was it doing audiobooks?
It was really easy because Amazon has recently introduced a service where they'll take the file for your digital book, your ebook, and they convert it. I'm sure they use the evil resource of AI. they convert it into an audiobook, and you, the author, get to choose from, I think it was 20 or 24 choices of narrators. So, for instance, I chose American Male Number 3.
Oh, okay.
You know, with a name like American Male Number 3, how could I resist?
Critically acclaimed, yes.
And yes, he's amazing. And you can also do things like speed up the pace of narration or slow down the pace of narration. And Amazon, I think, is doing this. I believe it's a beta test, and I think it's largely driven to fluff out their Audible offerings. Mm-hmm. But it also, I thought, why not? I can't. Right. I'm not in a position to afford to pay for audio recordings myself. I wish I were, but
yeah, no, I imagine it's interesting to hear your book come to life, because it's happening in your head.
Yes, right? Yes, very definitely. Because you asked earlier, do I visualize stuff when I'm writing? I definitely do, but I also hear the book as I'm writing. I hear the words, and I sometimes change the way a sentence is structured or the way a word I use, because I don't like the sound of it in my head.
Yeah.
And I think readers tend to do that.
Right. I think you're right. Well, Geoff, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. Welcome. And I want to wish you luck with The Devil's Vacation and Book 11, which we will look forward to in the not too distant future. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far. Best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you very much.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.